Let's cut to the chase, have an honest conversation, and develop real answers. As a matter of fact, with Andrew Cuomo. Welcome back to As a Matter of Fact. I'm Andrew Cuomo. You know, it's hard to believe that the summer is passing so quickly. The older we get, the faster time seems to move. I hope you're having a good summer. I'm having fun. I'm feeling good. And I am negotiating a trip to Europe with my 3 girls, which I am very excited about. We haven't decided where to go yet, and that's part of the negotiation. But secretly, I am lobbying for Italy, and I'm trying to line up the votes. It's a tough negotiation because they are very close and they talk to each other. But I have negotiating skills that they don't fully appreciate because I have negotiated many pieces of legislation with many different configurations. But whatever it is, it'll be good, and I'll keep you informed. Over these past few weeks, we've talked about politics, and we've talked about politics a lot, and President Biden and Trump, et cetera. So much so, frankly, that it bores even me. But there's a complex topic that is going to be of historic importance, and that's the issue of Ukraine. And there is a lot that is going on, and it's hard to decipher because it's highly sophisticated and complicated. But that's what I would like to talk about today. The first basic question is, who is winning the war? Again, I said I was exactly wrong in the beginning. I was shocked that Ukraine has been doing so well for so long. I saw this as David versus Goliath, with the superpower Russia coming in and just crushing poor Ukraine. But that is not what has happened. It is the resolute, it's the courage of the Ukrainian people. They have made significant military strides lately and military advantages. So they have been doing very, very well. Now, that's not to say that Russia has been standing still. They've actually gotten more aggressive. There was an agreement in place that would allow the Ukraine to do certain agricultural transfers that Russia recently reneged on and recently stopped. So again, it's back and forth, and who's winning and who's really making progress, it's hard to tell, and that is something that is worth talking about. The second question is the issue of Ukraine's acceptance by NATO. Now, this is a fundamental aspect of the dispute. Remember, Putin's original premise was that Ukraine was joining NATO, and that would put NATO at his doorstep. And they love to draw analogies to the United States to show that the United States is hypocritical in their opinion. And Putin's point was the Cuban Missile Crisis with President Kennedy. And what was our position? You can't have missiles in Cuba. They are at our front door. That was America's position. So Putin's theoretical position was, well, I can't have Ukraine in NATO just the way you couldn't have missiles in Cuba. Obviously, it was a stretch and it was not factual, but that was the basic gist of what Putin was saying. So if you now allow Ukraine to join NATO at this point, it would affirm Putin's original premise. Also, to have NATO allow Ukraine to join, you need a unanimous vote, which is easier said than done. And we have President Biden, who's obviously trying to walk this fine line, this tightrope, because we do support Ukraine. We are providing munitions and technical assistance, but they are not a member of NATO, and NATO is not now allowing them to actually join the coalition. So with all of that going on? Those are the two questions that we want to focus on. And I'd like to discuss them with someone who follows the situation closely. He writes books based on real life situations that he then fictionalizes. His name is Brad Thor. Brad has served as an advisor at one time to the Department of Homeland Security, where they bring in people from the private sector who they think actually have an expertise or a theory that could be advantageous. He has lectured to law enforcement organizations on terrorist threats and future military threats. He is a New York Times best-selling author. His novels blend fact and fiction by incorporating real-life world events into each narrative. So maybe, just maybe, with all the intrigue and all the subplots going on among America and Ukraine and Russia and China and the NATO alliance and Turkey, maybe Brad can share his theories and actually bring some light to this situation that is obviously happening in the shadows. Brad's new book is Deadfall, which involves the Ukraine-Russia conflict. So, welcome, Brad Thor.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about this. First, on the state of the war, if you will, between Russia and Ukraine. I will admit that I would have been very wrong, and if I had wagered someone, I would have lost a lot of money when this war first started. Because to me, it sounded like Russia versus Ukraine is David versus Goliath, right? Especially, my generation growing up with the fear of Russia as the superpower, etc. But as it goes on, it seems like Ukraine's resolve is getting stronger. They're more resistant. There was just an incident where they damaged the Kerch Bridge, which is a big bridge that goes from Russia to Crimea, a 12-mile bridge. So it's a big piece of infrastructure. But Russia is tough. There's no doubt about that. And they just stopped the grain transport that Ukraine was doing. That was a very big deal, and they had allowed it up until now. What's your take of it? How is Ukraine hanging in there the way they are, if you will? And how and when does this ever end?
Well, I'll tell you, as a Chicago guy, it does not surprise me that the Ukrainians are hanging in there. We've got a lot of Ukrainians in Chicago, and they are tough people. Even the descendants of Ukrainian immigrants in Chicago are tough people. I can tell you that firsthand. I got a lot of friends in that community. What's interesting to watch Russia and Ukraine in this, we're learning a lot. So much of our defense budget is predicated upon defending against Russia and China. And we're seeing that the Russian military has absolutely been hollowed out by the kleptocracy that exists in Russia. There's a lot of money over there, but it goes in the pockets of a few people, and it's really hurt their military. So that's been good for us to see that, because we will make our plans in the future based on knowing that Russia is not as much of a threat as we had thought they would be. We're going to have to focus on China, but back to the Ukraine issue. I heard a friend of mine, New Yorker, Jonah Goldberg, say something yesterday or over the weekend. And Jonah had said, listen, we all want the same end here. All of us, all people of good conscience want the same end here, which is for Russia to be out of Ukraine. And if we want that, then we have to be willing to supply the Ukrainians with everything they need. This slow trickle where Zelensky's got to ask 50 times before he gets something is dragging this out. Everybody was upset about cluster munitions and all that kind of stuff. The Russians are using cluster munitions over there, too. It would be nice if we didn't have to get to the point where the Russians were so entrenched that the Ukrainians need to ask for cluster munitions. But This thing, so to answer your question, it's kind of crazy, right? It's like, how long is a piece of string? How long is this going to go? Nobody really knows. But we can have a direct impact on whether this is a long, drawn-out stalemate, which is, if you want to play the realpolitik end of it, you could say that a long, drawn-out stalemate where Russia is bled to death in Ukraine is good for the rest of the world, particularly the West. But that's not the moral standpoint to come from, because that's bad for the Ukrainian people, and it's also long-term bad for the Russian people. What we want is a very decisive, definitive end to this war where Russia, pardon my French, gets their asses handed to them. And I think the only way that's going to happen is that if we step up with the F-16s, with the tanks, everything that Ukraine needs, because we keep hearing, oh, yeah, Russia's got a red line, and if we do this, it's going to cause a reaction. It's that's silly. Russia's in charge of how it thinks and sees and feels about the world, and there is no reason we can't continue to back up the Ukrainians and give them what they need. But the sooner they get what they need, the sooner we get to the end of this conflict. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. On the supplying Ukraine, it seems to me almost like we're half pregnant, right? If we're going to supply Ukraine with material and equipment, then supply Ukraine with material and equipment. If you're not, you're not. But once you decide that you are, which we clearly have, and we are providing aid, and we're providing quote unquote technical assistance, which could be a part of a whole chapter in one of your books, right? Under technical assistance, who do we actually send and what do they do? But we are there. So if you're there and you're supplying, then why not just do it, and do it to the volume and the extent that is actually going to make a difference?
Listen, I agree 100%. We don't send police officers out on the street with just a set of handcuffs, right? They have a whole range of tools in their toolbox to deal with the continuum of force that they see on the street every day. So we should be giving the Ukrainians everything that they need. They're not asking us for nukes. But if they want planes, if they want tanks, we've got this stuff that we can transfer to them. And this kind of foot dragging that happens is only making the war worse. So when you see kind of the crazy part of the Republican caucus, and I speak as a reformed Republican, somebody who left that party in 2018, you see these knuckleheads trying to cancel aid to Ukraine in Congress. It's insane. That's only going to make the war worse, and it's going to drag it out. We should all want the war over as fast as possible. And as you said, that in for a penny, in for a pound. We're there. Let's give them what they need, and let's get this thing over with as soon as possible.
How can Putin lose? Politically, how can Putin lose? How can he allow himself to lose to Ukraine and survive, right?
He can't. You mentioned the Kerch Bridge in the beginning, and this is something that Putin built. You said 12 miles long. It was billions of dollars, and it's very symbolic. It connects Russia with Ukraine. So there is this belief that Putin can't reassemble. He's a revanchist. He wants to reassemble the old Soviet Union. He wants the Russian Empire put back together again, and he believes that can't happen without Ukraine. But what did we see on June 23rd? We saw the Wagner Group roll 5,000 men, a column of armored vehicles, up to within 200 miles of Moscow. They shot down a surveillance plane, a few helicopters. He's got problems at home. And, we had all kind of crossed our fingers that weekend back on the 23rd of June, hoping that this was going to be the beginning of the end for Putin. Unfortunately, what we see is sometimes it's not the beginning of the end. We saw that with Chavez in Venezuela. And sometimes you got to be careful what you wish for. You saw Mubarak leave in Egypt and get replaced with al-Sisi, who's worse for democracy than Mubarak. So I don't think Putin can lose this and stay in power. I will also say I don't think he can stay in Ukraine and maintain power. I think he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. It's only a matter of time before he's overthrown. Okay.
So this is what you do. You vision this. How much time? How much time? He's bleeding. Ukraine is bleeding. Who's bleeding more? I don't know. I think it's on different levels. Politically, Putin is bleeding more, right? Zelensky is an international hero. and Putin is looking just shy of impotent. How long can this go on? When does it end?
I think this is one of the hardest things to predict when it comes to an autocrat, because we have, as good as our insight is into kind of what the intelligence world is doing, or what the intelligence community in Moscow is doing, and what's going on militarily, the intel, the ability to penetrate the FSB, the GRU, all of these different intelligence agencies in Russia. It's been amazing how we've kind of said, hey, they're about to do this, and we've been able to put it out in kind of the press and things like that before the Russians are able to pull any of these crazy false flags they've wanted to do. I don't think we have enough insight into the actual power circle around Putin. We know it's gotten closer, it's gotten smaller, it's shrunk. Particularly during COVID, you saw the long table he sat at. He was terrified of catching COVID. You see when he walks, he's got the dead right arm, and yet when you see him out in public, hobnobbing, kissing babies and things like that, there's a lot of stuff. A lot of people saying that's not actually him, because you see the right arm is not dead anymore. And here's a guy who's deathly afraid of catching COVID, but he's out kissing people and shaking hands. So this is the hardest thing to predict, is when it's going to end. I got to be honest with you. He's been in power 23 years. He's done an amazing job of hanging on this long, and I think we'd be foolish to think that he's on a slippery slope out the door. He could hang on for years still, unfortunately.
How long can Ukraine hold on?
I think Ukraine can keep holding on for a long time. I think if we continue to back them with munitions, and if you look at equipment and material, and then the people to train them on how to use the equipment, the voice out of the last NATO summit in Vilnius was unanimous. I mean, everybody is behind Ukraine. So the force in the West is, let's help them. Let's see this thing all the way through. There's no way Putin can win this. There's no way he can win it. And look at hitting that bridge on Monday was a big, huge thing. That's gonna hobble Putin. That's gonna really slow down his ability to get the supplies he needs into the people of Crimea and then forward onto his troops. So that's a big, big blow to Putin. And Zelensky's not going to just say, well, let's push them back to where they were. He's going to want to push them all the way out of the country. So this is going to end with the Russians outside Ukraine. They are not going to get to keep an inch of territory there. The Ukrainians just won't allow it.
Okay, let's say Putin is now desperate. It's gone on too long. He's losing political power. He's bleeding political power. He has to do something. Why doesn't he use more serious, more damaging military ammunition and just do significant damage to Ukraine and end it that way?
It's very possible. One of the Russian military doctrines that we're very frightened about, or we have been very reasonably concerned about, is this idea: escalate to de-escalate, which is that they would use a battlefield nuke of some sort, a limited capacity, a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. That we might say, oh my gosh, that's a step too far. We've now we've gotten closer to a nuclear war by him using this in Europe. Listen, he's a desperate guy. And they do desperate things when they get cornered. They're like animals, whether it's Saddam Hussein, whether it's Putin. So we don't know what he's going to do, which is why we need to put more things like Patriot missile batteries over there. This has been the other silver lining for us is we get to see a lot of our weapon systems being used in a theater of war, and to see how accurate and how excellent they are. I mean, we've got those Patriots shooting down Russian cruise missiles. I mean, this has been a big real life test scenario for American military hardware, and it's been fantastic all the way through. So yes, we need to assume that Putin is going to get more aggressive, and he's going to bring more I don't want to use the word aggressive again, but deadlier and more serious weapon systems to bear on the battlefield in Ukraine. And not just the battlefield. This is a guy who is taking those Shahed drones that he gets from the Iranians, and he's targeting water treatment facilities, power stations. They blew up the damn the dam and killed 55 people, wiped out a zoo. I'm an animal lover. I can't believe. Can you imagine if there was a dam and somebody flooded Central Park and killed all the animals in the zoo? I mean, it's just the loss of human life, just the loss of infrastructure, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, which is against the Geneva and Hague Conventions. I mean, this guy, Putin, is a war criminal, and I hope he will eventually stand in the dock in The Hague and be tried for these crimes, because this is serious stuff. Yeah. But we should expect it to get worse before it gets better, unfortunately.
I'm Brad Thor, and I want to write the great irony from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Putin says, I can't take this anymore. I am using nuclear weapons on a limited basis. I'm using nuclear weapons. And the great irony, President Biden, don't you say a word, because the United States taught the world how to end a war with nuclear weapons. So don't get on your high horse and start waving a banner at me. I learned from you.
Yeah.
The United States escalated to de-escalate. So I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah, I have to be honest with you. That is, number one, a horrific scenario. I don't know how we address that. I don't know if we immediately, put Ukraine in NATO, like instantly, and say that's it. No more. It ends right here. And if you light up another one, we're going to retaliate. I don't know. All I can hope is that we've got good men and women in the administration who, they're already thinking about this. That's the one thing I can tell you. I don't know what the answer would be militarily versus diplomatically. You raise an excellent point, because it's, get off your high horse. You guys did the same thing to end the war with the Japanese. But I think that the response would be swift. It would be unequivocal, and it would be overwhelming. And that might just be instant membership in NATO for Ukraine, so that we protect them from another strike, because another strike would be war on all of NATO. That might be the only real defensive capability that we could bring to bear instantly for the Ukrainians, but only after they've been hit with a nuke the first time.
So let's talk about that option. Let's say Putin gets desperate. He can't take it anymore. He's losing his political power. The war is going on too long. He has internal problems that are getting worse. He deploys a nuclear weapon that is somehow limited to the Ukraine area, that doesn't blow back on his country. What is Ukraine capable of doing from a military capacity point of view if that happens? What's their ability to retaliate?
So it depends. They've been showing an incredible ability to retaliate. We just saw the bridge get attacked. That was a pretty big deal. That's the second time. The first time was back in October. This is the second time that bridge has been hit, and that's very strategic for Putin. But they don't have any nukes over there. In fact, we convinced them when the Soviet Union broke apart, a third of the Soviet nuclear arsenal was in Ukraine, and we promised the Ukrainians, we said, listen, if you agree to let us help you dismantle these weapons, we'll sign an agreement saying you'll never be invaded. You'll never lose an inch of territory. It was called the Budapest Memorandum. And then in 2014, Putin and Russia had been a signer to that Budapest Memorandum. It was pre-Putin's power. But the Russians invaded in 2014, and we didn't do anything except they got kicked out of the G8. That's why we have a G7 now. It used to be the G8. We got rid of the Russians. Some sanctions, and then a very harshly worded letter from the Obama administration. But it didn't do anything. It's very similar to, I love the line from Francis Fukuyama that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. It says exactly what the Brits did with Neville Chamberlain meeting with Hitler. Hitler wanted the Sudetenland, that slice of Czechoslovakia, and the Brits gave it to the Nazis thinking this would slake their thirst for conquest, and it didn't. It just encouraged more of it. So we're seeing that again with Putin, and that's what's so scary, is you can look right back to the 30s and 40s in Europe, and you're seeing it all. Doesn't repeat, but it definitely is rhyming.
Okay, here's my second attempt at being Brad Thor. Here's the great irony and mystery. They did not dismantle the 1/3 of the nuclear munitions that they had. It never happened. Yes, they said they were going to do it. Yes, we said we were going to help them. But by the way, dismantling nuclear weapons is not the easiest task to begin with. And everybody signed all the paper, but it didn't happen. And there
This is
are still nuclear weapons in Ukraine that can be deployed.
So this sounds like the basis for a great thriller. That's what you're suggesting. Wouldn't it be the
Yes.
ultimate twist, if you will, on this story that that there's still nukes in Ukraine, which we don't know, and we help them. We certified all the dismantling. You know what? You may have a new chapter in life as a thriller author. That's a very clever idea.
Who certified?
We certified because we were worried that terrorists would get their hands on that arsenal. So that's why we spent our own money and spent all of this time and sent experts to Ukraine, is because we did not want some Chechen terrorist group or some Islamic terrorist group like Al-Qaeda going and being able to, I mean, listen, Ukraine still has a hangover of corruption from being in the Soviet system. And if you had been able to go back in there in the 90s and grab some of these nukes, I'm sure there would have been people who would have been willing to sell them to you. So, yeah, that'd be a great twist. Be a great twist.
I think it's going to sell. All right, let's go on to the next topic. There's a diplomatic dance that is going on at a very high level. It's more of a diplomatic ballet, okay? It's a pirouette. Putin's ostensible rationale for invading Ukraine is, I don't want Ukraine joining NATO. I don't want to have the enemy at my front door. Again, United States, you like to speak out of both sides of your mouth. What's good for you is not good for others. Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy says we can't have missiles that close to the United States. And that was a crisis. But NATO allowing Ukraine to join, you don't appreciate how damaging that is to me. And what you like to say is that, well, I'm Putin. I want to put together the whole Soviet Union again. That's not what it is. I just don't want NATO at my front door.
Well, frankly, it's nonsense, because Zelensky was willing to put that on the table and Putin wouldn't. When Putin brought that up, Zelensky was willing to discuss that and Putin wouldn't. So this is not about NATO. That's nonsense, because you would have seen Putin do a lot more up in Scandinavia on his border with Norway if he was that concerned, and Norway's a NATO member. It's nonsense. It is not. It was just like Putin said he was going in to denazify Ukraine, that they're all Nazis, including their Jewish president, a secret Nazi. It's nonsense. Putin is a revanchist. He wants to draw all this power back in. He wants to bring the former Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, back together, and he wants that to be his legacy. That's what it is. Everything else is a BS cover story out of him. It's nonsense.
Then why does President Biden go to such great lengths to walk the line between yes, we're going to allow NATO to bring in the Ukraine. We're preparing, we're thinking, we're studying, we're analyzing. Why such a fine line if that's the obvious truth?
First of all, it has to be unanimous. All the member states have to be on board, and the Turks have been a pain in the ass. Okay, we wanted Sweden in. They had the Quran burning. That made it difficult with Turkey. Erdogan was running this whole populist campaign. He had to get reelected. So now Erdogan's in. That's the wild card that we have, is keeping Turkey on board. You know, one of our big complaints with the Turks was that they were buying Russian missile systems, which meant that you would have air defense systems that were made in Russia. You'd have Russian instructors in Turkey teaching the Turkish Air Force that flies American aircraft about these missile systems. Turkey's been the biggest problem, I think, in NATO. I mean, they've got a massive army. But so Turkey's a problem. The other problem is the Article 5, which is an attack on one is an attack on all. If we admit Ukraine while there's an ongoing shooting war and another bullet is fired, another foot gets stepped into their territory, now all of NATO is responsible and gets drawn into this conflict. So you have to find a way to end it and then get NATO in, end it and then get Ukraine into NATO so that it doesn't have an Article 5 automatically triggered. You know, it's like, I'll help my brother when he's in a fist fight. I'd rather not, promise to help him while he's actively in the fist fight. I'd like to say, finish this fist fight, and if you ever get another one, I'm there for you.
Yeah, I have a brother who's just like that, by the way.
Is it a younger brother? Because they're always the problem. It's always the younger one.
Younger brother, yeah. Call me when it's over, and then I'm with you.
Yep.
But isn't that sort of where we are anyway? We're supplying materials, we're supplying technical assistance, but we're not in it fully. Would NATO's official endorsement really bring that much of a difference in terms of how we're deploying?
Well, if the Ukrainians were part of NATO, then we'd be committing troops. This is the greatest thing for us, is we are watching the hollowing out of the Russian military without a drop of American blood being spilled. And that's fantastic. That's fantastic. It is withering away before our eyes, and not a single American has died because they were committed by our military there. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing. And I think the Ukrainians have got what it takes to see this thing all the way across the finish line. We just need to get them the supplies they need as quickly as possible. We're finally doing it. Remember a while ago when we're like, we can't, the Poles wanted to give them aircraft? And we're like, well, wait a second. How do we get a NATO country to deliver aircraft without that being NATO flying aircraft into the conflict zone? We've come a long way since the beginning of this thing.
I got you. Last question.
Yep.
How does it possibly happen that the war ends and then NATO admits Ukraine? How does the war end in a way that Putin could ever live with NATO then admitting Ukraine? I mean, how do those things ever happen?
They might not happen. And this might be why somebody puts a knife in his back in the Kremlin late one night, is they realize that this guy is never going to leave Ukraine, that we're going to keep putting our precious young men through the meat grinder there. And it might be that that you get a coup that actually this time works, and it comes from the Russian military, that they don't want to see any more of their troops die there. This is embarrassing for Russia. The sanctions are just punishing the entire country. And you might get some men and women of good conscience that rise up against Putin and kill him and say, once Putin's dead, say he's the guy that wanted to stay in Ukraine. None of us wanted it. So as of 11 o'clock this morning, we are all turning around and leaving Ukraine. And that might be the way it has to happen, over Putin's dead body, literally.
Okay, here's my next thriller competitor for you. What's really going on is exactly that. There is a coordinated, quiet effort to develop opposition against Putin in Russia and back his political opponents in Russia. And certain NATO countries, the United States, that is an ongoing effort through Ukraine where we're fomenting political
strife and internal division and things like that. Yeah, I got to tell you, that one is so hard to see. I don't know how much penetration we have of his inner circle. I think Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, when he sent his 5,000 men north towards Moscow on June 23rd, I think he had a lot of those pieces in place. And then when it came time to lay your cards on the table, he didn't have the support that he needed. So I'd like to think we're doing it with the Brits and in some of our other sympathetic allies who really have a lot of reason to want him gone. But, we won't know till we know. This is why tradecraft happens in the darkness.
Great. Brad Thor, thank you so much. We enjoy your books and your commentary and your insight and your perspective is very informative. Thank you very much for taking the time with us.
Pleasure being with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.